Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Hodges. I'm the president of McGuireWoods Consulting. We're really happy to have you here today to talk about the 2020 South Carolina elections. First, let me say a few words about our operation. McGuireWoods Consulting is a subsidiary of the McGuireWoods law firm. We have over 1,200 lawyers in the United States and the United Kingdom, and our consulting firm is a full-service public affairs firm with over 100 professionals. We have one of the largest state government affairs footprints in the United States. We have offices in Washington, D.C., the southeastern states, Texas, Illinois, and California. We offer traditional lobbying and state and local government consulting, and we also have a national practice focused on the governors, attorneys general, education officials, and also insurance commissioners. We have communications and PR services and infrastructure, economic development incentives practices for our clients as well. Before I turn the program over to my colleague Brian Flynn from our South Carolina office, I was asked to offer a few general comments about the national 2020 elections. And then Brian and our great speaker group will focus on the South Carolina elections. Just a couple of things that I would share. I don't think the outcome of the presidential election was particularly surprising in terms of the states won, which look like there'll be about 306 electoral college votes at the end of the day. And I don't know that the margin was particularly surprising. It'll likely end up being around 5 million votes or so. The surprising parts, I think, were the closeness of the margin in the swing states, which many of you have seen, and the strength of the overall turnout. President Trump again showed an ability to draw occasional voters to the polls in a way that other candidates have not, which I think explains in part the stronger than expected performance of down-ticket Republican candidates in various places around the United States. Second takeaway, we will likely have divided government again in Washington, with a Democratic president and House and a Republican U.S. Senate, dependent upon, of course, the outcome of the Georgia Senate races, which will be occurring in early January. Now, this means that we will not have some of the dramatic changes that people contemplated in areas like the composition of our Supreme Court and health care tax policy. Those things simply aren't going to happen for the next 2 years. What I would expect would be a focus from a President Biden on the use of executive orders to accomplish policy objectives, and a search for issues where collaboration across party lines is possible. Areas like infrastructure development, we talked about infrastructure bills at the federal level for some time, workforce development, and of course the ever-present issue of COVID relief and the distribution of any potential vaccine we might have. I would also say that at the state level that we could look for efforts by a new administration to engage the governors and other state officials on issues like health care coverage, given that significant changes in the current law cannot happen without some Republican support. That's a quick overview of the elections from a national perspective and also a quick discussion of some of the policy implications. Now I'm going to turn it over to Brian Flynn to handle the remainder of the program. Brian?
Thank you, Governor. First of all, we are honored to have our 4 speakers today, and I'm going to introduce our first 2 that are very well-regarded and good friends of our firm. Antoine Seawright is the founder and CEO of Blueprint Strategy. It's a public relations and political consulting firm based in South Carolina. He has advised campaigns for governors, U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, state and legislative candidates, and serves as an advisor to the Democratic National Committee. Antoine is also a writer for The Hill and is a CBS News political contributor. Our other speaker, Walter Wetzel, is a political strategist and founder of Starboard Communications and is a PR and marketing firm. Wetzel is a well-regarded political strategist and campaign consultant who helped elect current Congressman Jeff Duncan and Ralph Norman and Senator Tim Scott, among many others in South Carolina. He has also recently started the Super PAC in support of Lindsey Graham's re-election here in South Carolina. I'll get started with the first question, and this one will go to Antoine. Antoine, obviously played a key role in are well known in Democratic circles. What are your thoughts or any comments you may have about the presidential race, where we are at with it right now? Obviously, we've got President-elect Biden has been named by the media as coming on board. What are your thoughts here, and what do you think the next days and months look ahead for a President-elect Joe Biden?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Amber, Brian, and to the Governor Hodges, to the entire McGuireWoods team for being kind enough to invite me. Look, I said September 1st, 2017. It was a political headline. It was funny at the time, but it was serious business for me. I said the road to heaven and the White House runs through South Carolina. I referenced South Carolina as God's country. I also said whoever can receive strong, deep, and wide support from the African American community would not only be the Democratic nominee, but they will likely end up being the President of the United States. And I said black voters will have a large say-so in what the future of this country looks like when it comes to the presidency and down-ballot races. Well, all those things came to be true. South Carolina changed the course of history with Jim Clyburn inserting himself in the process. Fast forward the tape, we ran the table in South Carolina, went on to Super Tuesday, the nomination, and then the general election. 5 states that I thought were going to be consequential end up determining the future of this country, i.e. Joe Biden being the president-elect and Kamala Harris, for the first time in American history, a black woman, a woman of color, as the vice president of the United States. That is the story of this election. Literally, Democrats won this race because of African-American voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and black and brown voters in Arizona and Nevada. We were able to pick up 2 Senate seats. And I think that the story has yet to be told because we're still counting votes. But when it's all said and done, I don't know if this was a response to Donald Trump 100% per se. I think this was a response to the country figuring out their net worth through their participation. I caught some hell a couple of weeks ago, or it's been a month or so ago, when I said in the article I was quoted that black voters were going to be casting a survival vote in this election. And this election was literally going to be life or death, and so look for that to fuel their turnout. It wasn't about Donald Trump. When I look at the places where the drop-off happened in 2016, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Detroit, just to name a few, Philadelphia, those margins were made up in a big way in 2016. That took Joe Biden over the top. You asked what's next? I think today's rollout of the coronavirus task force is probably a flirtation for what's next for the vice president-elect and for the president-elect. I do think that, in fact, I know after some conversations with them over the weekend, that their number one priority is getting their arms around a response to this coronavirus. They're going to follow the health experts. They're going to listen to the science, and they're going to do everything we can to get this country back on track and back focused in terms of wrapping their arms around the coronavirus and the response. As it relates to the electoral part of this, obviously the Donald Trump campaign and the Republicans are going to play this political game of lawsuits, putting a dark cloud around the election results one way or another. But as my mother would always tell me growing up, son, what's delayed will ultimately never be denied. And I'm totally convinced with a 4 million margin plus growing election, the numbers are way too deep and wide for any lawsuit to make up the difference. And I think that very soon we will hear officially President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris.
Okay, thank you, Antoine. I appreciate that. Walter, do you have any thoughts on the presidential election from your viewpoint?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Nationally, my suspicion is we will be talking about what a fantastic candidate that Joe Biden was, and I don't think that ought to go unrecognized. and had Democrats nominated any other candidate other than Biden, I think it is inarguable that the election would have been tighter, and Trump may have won. And I would point you to 2 points or less in Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and a good reason to believe other Democrats might have lost in those states. And the perfect example of that is the one electoral vote Biden picked up in Nebraska too. Okay, so he wins Nebraska too. It's a district Clinton lost by 2. Democrats did have a very progressive candidate, a woman named Eastman. She was Medicare for all and endorsed by some of the more progressive Democrats. She lost that district by 5. Biden won by almost 7. It was a huge swing, and lots of crossover. Biden, in this case, our candidate, the Republican's name was Bacon, so you had Biden-Bacon voters. I think you will find that that's happened in many places. Nationwide, Biden fared 2.4% percentage points better than the average Democrat nominee for Congress in that district, and in several swing states, including Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Biden did better than the Democrat nominee did for Senate. So that does mean a small segment of Americans chose Biden and a Republican congressional candidate. And I think my gut is, Brian, neither party ought to overlook that and take much from it. Democrats can't conclude that America has turned to some left-leaning country, and so they're going to push private health insurance or defund the police or abolish immigration enforcement or vote out Republicans because, of some, extreme anti-abortion judges or anything. Lots of working-class voters, white voters, Hispanic voters, African-American voters disagreed with those sorts of issues. But the notion that Democrats, that some Republicans are arguing, should simply move to the center on every issue, that seems wrong as too. We had a minimum wage bill passed in Florida with 61% of the vote. We had several states with drug decriminalization measures that passed, several expanded Medicaid and health insurance programs for low income. So Republicans have a different set of problems now, right? I mean, they've lost the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 elections, and I think are probably in a messy struggle to see just what kind of influence the Team Trump continues to have within the party. So I think those are the key lessons. Brian, I'd also just point out one kind of fun little fact, and I'll end this comment with this. Brandon and Representative Ott and even Antoine, I'm sure you have clients, and Ed O'Keefe, a CBS News reporter, on Saturday night tweeted out something that I thought was brilliant, and he basically said a Biden advisor told him several weeks ago before the election, and here's the quote: "A crucial part of our strategy was that we turned off Twitter. We completely stayed away from it. We knew the country was in a different headspace than social media was suggesting." So I just throw that out. I don't know how many times we've had that conversation with our clients. Please, for God's sake, put down your phone and enough with Facebook and Twitter. But I thought it was fun to have them confirm that.
No,
hey Brian, can I just say? Hey Brian, can I say one thing to follow up on his point? So here's what we do, and I think Walter's right. Look, this election was much tighter than everyone anticipated. The truth be told, yes, there was a surge in turnout. This was the first time in American history you had 32 million eligible Latino voters, 30 million eligible African-American voters. I think some Democrats make the assumption, because we had a handsome win in 2018 when Trump was not on the ballot, that those voters would come back out and vote for us in 2020. That did not happen. That's part of the reason we lost some of the congressional seats we won in 2018. And truth be told, there was a surge in Donald Trump turnout on Election Day in places where Democrats expected to do well because of some of the polling. Now, I've gotten off the polar coaster a long time ago, very early in my career, because I know they're only a snapshot of the time. I don't think anyone anticipated, white women in particular, voting the way they did in the presidential election because of how they voted in the 2018 midterms and what the polling or survey indicated going up to election. I don't think you can underestimate the gravity of Donald Trump and his footprint on American politics, because if it wasn't deep or wide, we probably would not be in this posture of some of these races being this close, and Democrats would have not lost some congressional seats we had lost. However, I think what the Republican Party is going to have to do, not that I'm a Republican and not that I will try to play one on this call, what they're going to have to do is what we had to do in 2012 after Barack Obama, figure out what life is like after our leader's no longer in office. And I think that's going to be the challenge for Republicans or Democrats. Our challenge is going to be, how do we work together with a slim margin in the House, with a majority Republican Senate who's already declared war and they will not work with us, going into midterms elections that could be even more consequential than the 18 midterms, because you have some of the most pivotal governor's races in the country up, including the 3 or 4 states we won this cycle, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, add Ohio to that bunch. So it's going to be an interesting time, and I don't think anyone can declare an overall victory, but what I think Democrats can declare, and Walter, you may disagree, that's fine, is that we may not have won the battle, but we indeed won the war.
Well, thank you guys for your thoughts on the presidential cycle. I want to kind of shift it to South Carolina and briefly touch over and get both of your thoughts on both the federal races in South Carolina and then obviously the legislative makeup here in South Carolina. Walter, can you kind of go over and discuss kind of the big federal races here in South Carolina and how you saw those play out?
Sure. And, you know, our wonderful, indomitable, state representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter had a brilliant quote in the state paper yesterday to the answer to your question, Brian, and she very eloquently just said, we got our butts kicked. I think if you look at kind of what happened in South Carolina, it wasn't, it just wasn't consistent with what was going on at the very, very top of the ticket. Democrats were expected to flip 10 or 12 legislative bodies. They didn't flip any. The Republicans weren't expected to flip any. They flipped 2. Again, that's not a South Carolina specific thing. The most interesting thing I thought here was, I don't know if this happened other places, but there were actually more voters in the U.S. Senate race in South Carolina than there were voters in the presidential race in South Carolina. That is the first, the first time I have ever seen that. In terms of the big race, the Graham Harrison race. Look, I think at the end of the day, Harrison's consensus path to victory was to max out the Dem share of his vote at 47, 48 maybe, hold Lindsey under 50, and really hope that Bledsoe got 4 or 5 points. And of course, none of those 3 things happened, and in large part, they didn't happen, in my mind, for kind of 2 reasons. One, Lindsey doubled down on Trump, and that proved to be a good strategy. And 2, and we'll talk about this in a second, the very, very flawed and failed strategy of the Harrison campaign on the Bledsoe stuff. So here's what we had. 23 days out, we had the race tied. That's not a public poll. That is our internal poll. 23 days out, Jamie Harrison released a poll that he was up by 2. 21 days out, Morning Consult released a poll that had it dead even. All of the machinations about polling and how ineffective or unpredictive or short of the forecast that came up, I happen to believe that 23 days out, this race was very, very, very close. We also did a poll. We were tracking every day. So 8 days out, the Monday, the week before the election, we had Graham up 9. So what happened in those intervening 15 days? Well, the primary thing that happened was, Harrison just went all in on this strategy of pushing people to Bledsoe. He put his name on television ads, which I was surprised at, but a lot of his, third party groups, some group called South Carolina Liberty, put out 4 or 5 pieces of mail to hard Republicans, pushing this notion that Lindsey Graham was not conservative enough for them, and the only way to have our wonderful Senate seat stay as a conservative is to vote for Bledsoe. Harrison's online spin was a little bit different, but nonetheless, they spent $12, $13, $14 million on this plan that I'm sure was concocted back in July when it was a great idea, right? But Bledsoe getting out of the race and throwing his support to Lindsey Graham, we saw it in the polls. We were stupefied that Harrison just went all in and kept re-upping the ante on what was clearly a very, very failed strategy. And most people believed that it was a reflection that Harrison either thought we were dumb or he was just not being ingenious. I mean, he was being disingenuous. Very strange. I think that was one reason Graham did so well. The second reason Graham did so well is straight ticket votes. For the first time, huge straight ticket numbers. 65% of every vote cast in South Carolina, early, absentee, by mail, in person on election day, 65% were straight ticket voters. 59% of the straight tickets were Republicans. To give you some idea, that's a plus 17 number. In 2016, straight ticket voters were plus 2, Republicans plus 2. So a gigantic effort that paid off on the part of the Graham campaign, the state Republican Party, the super PACs that were supporting Graham on pushing this straight ticket. And candidly, 68% of every vote 68% of the votes Lindsey Graham got were straight ticket voters. And so I think that was a huge piece of it. And the third thing I think, that's due to this big margin is just candidly Republicans for the first time had a real ground game, particularly in the first, Brian, which we'll go into in a second. But a real ground game. The Democrats normally do a very good job at ground game activities, and I think the COVID circumstance had them spooked more than it spooked Republicans. They were more cautious, and that so not only in the absence of a Democrat ground game, but in the presence of a sophisticated Republican ground game, I think is why you saw some of the results. I think that was a big deal in Nancy Mace. And look, we'll talk about legislative stuff in a second. The Harrison move from even to losing by 10 in the last 14 days, I think trickled down as probably one of the major factors in why Nancy Mace won. Certainly was a major factor in why some of the Democrat legislative members lost as well.
Thanks, Walter. Antoine, can you kind of go over a little bit and specifically about the South Carolina Senate and what the shakeups there have been, and kind of give us some insight as to what the Senate might look like moving forward in 2021?
So a couple of things. I think the most important thing Walter said was the stat about 64% people voted straight party ticket, and that 59% voting straight Republican. I'm 35 years old. I'm black, and I'm a Democrat. So I've had my share of losses working in South Carolina politics for the past 17 years based on those three things alone. And what I do know is that it's always an uphill battle in South Carolina to win statewide, but also to convince Republican voters that perhaps they have been voting against their interests and they should try something different. All of us knew that going into this race. I know a lot of people giving Jamie hell, a lot of people giving Democrats hell, but when I look at the margins around the country, when I look at the South Carolina margins, when I look at the fact that Vincent Shaheen lost, Glenn Reese lost, Lloyd Nicholson lost, Joe Cunningham lost, I am totally convinced Walter, you get a kick out of this, that if Donald Duck was on the ballot as a Republican this cycle in South Carolina, he may have won. Because I look at Shaheen's opponent. No one in Kershaw County, for the most part, knew who she was. I spoke to her consultant a couple of days ago. Their internals had Vincent Shaheen beating her by double digits. She did not nearly spend the same amount of money or even close to running what I would describe as a reasonable campaign, but she won. And that's no disrespect to her, but the fact that she put her name on the ballot, the Trump wave was so real in rural parts of South Carolina that she won. And I think that's probably the story for Nicholson, Reese. I think that was probably the story for Joe Cunningham, because the South Carolina results are very reflective of other states like North Carolina and others that had these down ballot races where it was just a wave and you had a surge in white turnout, particularly in rural parts of this country, and you can attribute that to some of the success. What the Senate will look like or the House going back into next year, it will look totally different. Not only did we lose experience and wisdom as Democrats, we lost the ability to be able to work with reasonable Republicans in the state legislature to get things done on behalf of South Carolina and not get so focused on the noise that we cannot hear the lyrics of what is important to South Carolina. I came to no conclusion that it was going to be this overly handsome night for Democrats in this state and we were just going to wipe the floor. I do agree with Walter on the Jamie Harrison campaign. I think the race was competitive until we got to probably the last 10 days because you had people who were looking for a reason to vote for the Republican candidate or the Republican Party, not necessarily Lindsey Graham. And I think between the Supreme Court process and the confirmation, I think between the real investment into this state by the National Republican Party and others, I think that really ramped it up. And I think the fact that Trump was able to close in late and bring some voters home to the Republican Party, I think that made a heck of a difference. Now, there's one thing Walter said earlier that I have to push back on. I don't know any Democrat around the country who ran on defunding the police, socialism, and all that tomfoolery we hear on social media. Now, did the Republicans use that to try to paint a certain picture about Democrats? Absolutely. They do it all the time. It's red meat for their crowd. But we didn't run on that. But those are the kind of things that end up coming to haunt us in the end because those are the only things that Republicans did to define some Democrats who won in places in 18 that Trump lost in 16 that we had to defend and compete in 2020. So I think the Republican agenda in the state legislature is going to be just to try to ram and jam everything they can down their throats, whether it's good or bad, but to check a box. At the end of the day, I don't know if that will be good for South Carolina because you still have reasonable Democrats, at least in the state Senate I can speak to, who are willing to work across the aisle to get things done because South Carolina, the General Assembly, is not like Washington, D.C. We don't function as a dysfunctional body. In fact, we function in a very smart, strategic way where people have their politics, but their politics does not necessarily drive the end of the policy debate.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've got sorry, Walter, if you got a quick thing, Walter, and I'll switch to a question from the audience.
Yeah, no. Point well taken, Antoine. My only that was in my thought process was the moderates do better than outspoken progressives theory back to the Biden theory, and you know you can look at a district. I got that she's an extreme, okay, but you can look at Ilhan Omar's district. She got 64% of the vote. Biden got 80 in that district. So that was my only point. I totally agree. That was not it was something Republicans tried to exploit, certainly. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got a question from the audience, and this can go to either one of you, and then we'll kind of switch over to the next year's legislative preview. Do you all think that a President Biden administration will likely look at shutting down the economy again?
No. What I think you'll see from this administration is you're going to see them, one, really lean in on the experts about what we need to do in terms of having a reasonable nationwide strategy in response to this pandemic. By the way, that is going to ramp itself up as we get closer to the holidays, etc. So please wear your mask and be safe. But two, you're going to see a Biden administration who's going to work with Mitch McConnell, or attempt to probably get some sort of stimulus package done, because the American people not only want it, but they need it. And I don't see a scenario, unless this virus just becomes so bad, where you have to shut down the economy. In fact, I don't think the American experiment, contrary to what Republicans say, Democrats don't want to just wake up one morning, flip a switch down, and turn off the economy. What I think we all want to do is be strategic about it so that people may not die. And you cannot put the livelihood over people, over talking points, in political talking points, whether it's on TV, radio, digital, whatever. And I think that's what you're going to see from this administration. I do think that the president-elect, Vice President Biden, is going to surround himself with strategic people, but I do think he's going to have a core group of Republicans who know Joe Biden very well, who are going to be willing to work with him to get something done, because I don't think anybody wants more people to die. I don't think people want this economy to shut down, but I also think people are realistic about what this virus has done and what it will do if we do not take it serious.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to switch it kind of over to our two legislative friends who are on here to kind of discuss a 2021 legislative preview. I'll introduce our two speakers now. We have Representative Brandon Newton. He is a House member from represents Lancaster and York counties. He is 26 years old and is we still think, the youngest member serving in the House of Representatives here in South Carolina. He is also on staff at the University of South Carolina Lancaster and was the previous chairman of the South Carolina Lancaster County Republican Party. We also have Representative Russell Ott. He's a Democrat who represents Calhoun, Lexington, and Orangeburg counties and serves on the Labor and Commerce and Industry Committee in the House. And he has served in the House since 2013, and before that previously worked with South Carolina Farm Bureau. So I will kick it off with you guys. Brandon, I'll kick this one off to you first. And then, Russell, feel free to jump in. What do you guys see the big issues coming up for the 2021 session?
Well, first, thank you all very much for having me. I always enjoy getting to do this. So thank you for the invitation. I think, obviously the coronavirus is still going to be an issue we're going to be debating once we get back into session. I think there's a very good chance that the thing that will dominate the first half of session will be the budgetary process, either through passing a budget for this current fiscal year and then also beginning to do one for the next one. Those two issues, I think, are going to dominate the first couple months. I think a lot of that's going to depend on our estimates we're going to get from revenue and fiscal affairs and then where we go from there. So I think, realistically, we're going to be still talking about COVID for at least the first couple months. And then, as always, a lot's going to be determined upon what does D.C. do and what does D.C. decide that it wants to do around COVID. I think that's going to impact a lot of the decisions that we're going to be making in Columbia. So, going forward, I don't think the music or the tune's going to change much from this year. I think COVID's going to be dominating most of our session.
Russell, do you have any thoughts on what 2021 might look like for the legislative session?
Sure, Brian. How's everybody doing? Sure appreciate the opportunity to be on. Really enjoyed the first segment. I don't know that the nuts and bolts that Brendan and I will be talking about is as exciting, but what we're excited to get back, I think it's just going to be really, really different. As everyone knows, 2020 was certainly a much different session than any of us have ever experienced. We kind of had starts and stops continuously throughout the session. Actually finished work, I guess that was in August when we actually passed some legislation on the last couple of days. I think that kind of is going to continue. Typically, you don't see a whole lot happening in the first year of a legislative session for the first couple of months. I think we're going to have a feeling out process as was mentioned in the first session, we've got a lot of new members. We in the House Democratic Caucus also lost 2 members. Last Tuesday, Mandy Powers-Norrell and Laurie Funderburk. And we had a lot of members resign. So Brandon might know the number of new representatives that we have coming in, but I think it's in the double digits at least. So there'll be a learning curve for those folks. We don't know yet what the committee assignments are going to be. So, all of that kind of leads to the first couple of months of session just kind of being very slow. A lot of committee work will transpire then. I agree with Brandon that the budget is going to be at the top of the list. Obviously, we are continuing to work in a continuing resolution right now. We don't have a passed budget for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. So, we're gonna come back into session. We'll probably have some non-recurring money that we will debate. I don't see us really passing any recurring dollars, for this particular fiscal year. I know the BEA is continuing to meet. I think they meet again tomorrow. From what I can gather, talking with the staff on Ways and Means, I don't think we should expect any cuts next fiscal year, but I don't think that we're going to have very much growth. I do think a lot of the experts believe that we have hit the floor. We've kind of bottomed out on the regression of the revenue, but I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of additional revenue for us to be able to work with. So, kind of heading into next year, my hope and prayers are that we don't have to have any backslide, any cuts to any of our state agencies. But I don't think that anyone should really expect any huge growth. So, the budget's going to be huge. We've got a lot of other issues. Clearly, Santee Cooper, Brian, is going to be another issue that we don't have any finality on yet, that I think will kind of dominate the headlines. Again, we have to find some resolution on Santee Cooper. We have kind of had this dragging out now for the last couple of years. We had a process in place where we accepted bids from potential private sector utilities to come in and buy Santee Cooper. Those weren't really met with a lot of enthusiasm in the General Assembly. So we kind of, we got this process where it's kind of still ongoing. I know that there's a lot of folks that are still very interested in offloading Santee Cooper. I am of the opinion, that regardless of whether we do end up selling or not, I think that has to be driven by long-term utility rates. And also what we can get out of Santee Cooper, but I'm not one that is of the opinion sell just to sell. But I am one that believes that regardless of a sale, that we have to have some major reform of Santee Cooper. I think that is evident. That has become evident over the last several years that regardless of whether we sell or don't sell, that we have to make some major changes with Santee Cooper. So I think, those will be two that I think everyone should continue to keep an eye on. Broadband is a major issue. We've all seen our liabilities with broadband, particularly in the rural areas like where I represent and Brandon represents. We did pass a bill at the very end of the session back in August, I think, which allows our electric cooperatives to get into the broadband business. So I think you'll see that really transpire. They're able to serve their customers within their districts, and I think 2 miles outside of their current territories. So that is something that I hope we continue to keep a focus on, is making sure that we kind of bring South Carolina into the 21st century and get broadband to the places that we have to have it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Quick question. Obviously COVID's had a huge impact on the state's business and it's running it. What do you guys have any insight as to what next year is going to look like in terms of the legislative committees. I know in this past session, folks would come in and we did a lot of virtual meetings and virtual committee hearings, and then folks were spread out in the chamber. Have you guys heard any thoughts or gotten any guidance as to what that might look like? We've got some promising news on the vaccine front this morning, but just curious as your thoughts as what next year might look like in terms of day-to-day business at the state house.
Russell, if you want to take this one, you might know a little more about this than I do.
Yeah, I think it's to be determined, Brian. It's kind of like you said. I mean, I will give great adulations to Speaker Lucas. As we were coming back, there were just times that we had to come back this year. There was just too much business that was left unattended. We had to come back in. Jay did a great job of taking all of the necessary precautions to try to make sure that everyone was as safe as possible, not just the members, but also the staff and also the folks that have to come to the State House to advocate on behalf of their clients and their businesses. And I think you'll see more of the same. I think it'll be a to be determined type scenario. Obviously we're very, very hopeful and prayerful that we're going to get our arms around this pandemic, and we'll start seeing the numbers continue to drop, and hopefully sooner rather than later we'll get back to business as usual. But I also think that if they don't, then yes, we're gonna have to have some protocols in place that limits the interaction between folks, and just trying to make sure that we're able to keep a safe distance while at the same time making sure that we continue to do the work of the people of South Carolina. I haven't heard of any altered schedules at this particular point, Brian. We go back in December the 1st and 2nd for an organizational session when we'll be able to, kind of find out. We'll select seats and we'll receive our committee assignments at that particular time. And so maybe that'll give us some type of idea if there's going to be any major changes heading into January, but I think it's ultimately going to be dictated by the numbers and kind of where we go with the pandemic and the virus.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Brandon.
I was going to say, I totally agree with Russell on that. I think the speaker did a great job of trying to limit as much exposure that we would have with the public, with staff, with each other as we could. I think by the time we get to January, which is still a couple months off, and a couple months in this virus is like an eternity. So a lot's going to be determined on where we are when we get there. Of course, the vaccine news this morning was really good to hear. And part of the issue we're going to be running up to pretty soon is, we basically just kind of stopped things in their tracks this year. But there's a lot of pressing issues that aren't just COVID related that we need to start addressing. And I think that it's going to, kind of force our hand on a lot of stuff. So I do think it's good that we are going to be going back in January. And even with we have precautions, I think you'll see a lot more action this year coming up than you did in this current year.
Okay, great. Well, we know one of the big issues that's going to come up this year that's going to affect every member of the legislature and every elected official is the reapportionment process. Can you guys give us both of your thoughts on the reapportionment process, and when will that begin? When will that process begin with you guys this year?
So
you want me to try?
I guess I'll go first on this one, I guess. Reapportionment. I was not in the State House during the last reapportionment in 2011. I was actually in the 11th grade, so I was a little busy during that. For example, locally for me, my State House district is actually the most overpopulated in the state. Just for an example, in my election, I received 23,000 votes on Tuesday. My opponent received 13,000 votes. We mentioned earlier the state Senate race with Vincent Shaheen. I actually received more votes than the candidate who won that race, even though I represent a House district and that was a Senate district that's also in my region. So redistricting, of course, for people like me is going to be something, we're looking forward to, in that my district will shrink a lot. But I think timetable-wise, I think it'll probably be the second half of session. A lot of it's going to be determined on the census and when we get those numbers. I don't think there's a real definite date yet on that. With all the delays that have been happening with the census, I think you could easily see that pushing us back some compared to what they used to do. But I do think it's going to be probably the fight of the second half of session. As I said, the first half I think it's going to be dominated through the budgeting process. But I think, the reapportionment of both legislative lines and congressional lines is something we're going to be doing, especially once we get to April and May, and we hopefully have the census data we need to do that.
Yeah, I think Brandon's exactly right, Brian. Look, as a Democrat in South Carolina right now, I would say reapportionment is not really something we're going to be looking forward to, and that's simply a consequence of the elections. Again, losing some seats in the Senate and losing some seats in the House. I think that obviously we're not going to have as loud a voice to be able to advocate for seats as we may have if we would have had some additional members. That is something that is a little bit concerning. I'll just throw this out there since we're talking about it. I'm not a big fan of legislators drawing our own lines. It's unfortunate. We had one of our biggest advocates for that opinion in Laurie Funderburk and Manny Powers Norrell, who have introduced legislation over the course of the last several years to go to more of an independent type commission that draws the lines in a more equitable and fair way. Again, both of them lost their elections, and I think that's unfortunate. But nevertheless, this is where we are. This is the process, and Brandon is exactly right. The first step is to get the census data back, to find out. I think we all obviously understand that we have increased in population. It is a little bit concerning. Unfortunately, South Carolina, I think, is at the very back of the pack nationwide as far as our census participation. And that has huge ramifications on the amount of federal money we bring into the state. So, that's concerning. But we all know that, we've got some huge population places like Charleston, Brandon's area up in Lancaster, Rock Hill, that the population has exploded. So places like Brandon's district will get smaller. Places like my district, where I actually have, from all expectations, I'll have less population. My district will have to expand. The question is, where do I go? You'll have districts moving from the coast into the Midlands, and I think it's going to be very problematic to figure out what happens. I think you will see some legislative districts combined with other districts. So you'll end up, at the end of the day, probably having incumbent legislators that get drawn into districts with other incumbent legislators. So that's going to have huge impacts and ramifications on the 2022 elections. But as far as the process is concerned, I think the summer of 2021 is where the vast majority of your reapportionment work will take place. I think you'll have a lot of work taking place there. And then just as food for thought, just to give people an expectation, I think regardless of what happens, the lines end up in court. I think I'd love, Governor Hodges could probably speak to it better than anyone on this call. But I think folks have already started to posture that wherever the lines end up, I think they'll be ultimately litigated in court before we have any finality of what they're going to look like by the 2022 elections. Just something to think about.
Okay, that's good. Thank you guys for that. Can we talk education reform? Obviously that was a big issue, or one of the top issues in the state before the COVID shutdown. Obviously our schools, a lot of our schools, our kids are in either a hybrid setting or a virtual setting. Russell, can you give us any insight, and Brandon, feel free to jump in as well. Russell, any thoughts on if you guys will address education reform? Obviously, teacher pay was a big item that had broad support, but obviously the budget issues affected that. Can you just briefly touch on education and some of the important issues with that in light of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, my fear, Brian, is that we might regress into some partisanship on that early on. I think it depends on where our school districts currently are across the state. Once we get into session in January, I do believe there's a number of legislators that would probably seize on the opportunity to try to force school districts back into a 5-day-a-week type of setting. And again, I think it's just very important. Look, we all want our children. I've got one child right here that I'm looking at making himself lunch as I'm on this call because, he's doing school from home. I had my youngest started 4-day-a-week. Today was the first day. So we all want our kids back in class, and particularly our younger students. I think our elementary and early middle school kids really, really need to be back in class as soon as possible. So that is a possibility. As far as the funding is concerned, teachers are pretty upset right now. We did not pass a step increase on the state level. We did not pass a step increase this current year. So there were some districts that the more affluent districts across South Carolina were able to give the step increases themselves to their teachers, but there were some districts that weren't able to afford it. So, I think there will continue to be a push by the teachers across the state for South Carolina to, fulfill that funding promise that we make to them and try to get that step increase to them early on in the 2021 legislative session. Education reform, Brian, it's just something that we weren't able to get across the finish line, unfortunately. I think it continues to be an issue. I just don't know what the legislative appetite is going to be for that early on. It's like Brandon was talking about. There's a lot of other issues that I think are going to dominate the headlines. And for anyone that follows South Carolina politics and South Carolina General Assembly, each year there seems to be a couple of issues that receive the vast majority of attention. And there's not but so much room for so many big ticket items. And, education reform continues to be just a huge undertaking that we haven't been able to get our arms around. It's something that we desperately need to. I think it's ultimately what continues to hold our state back is education. Everything revolves around education, from economic development to, attracting industry into South Carolina. They want a workforce that is ready and prepared. And I just believe that we haven't done as much as we can do. And I think that until we really decide that we're going to do what it takes to try to improve our educational system, we're going to continue to have some problems. So I'd love to see it. I just don't know what the appetite is going to be with some other issues that seem to be dominating the headlines right now.
Okay, that sounds good. Go ahead, Brandon.
No, I was going to say, go ahead, Brian. It's okay. I was just going to say I agree with Russell on a lot of that. That was a good way to sum it up. I mean, I think that the issues we're going to be discussing now is probably going to crowd out a lot of education-related matters. And then, I think there's a lot of members who probably have a lot of fatigue about the last couple of years, education dominating the last 2 years of session. I think there's going to be a lot of members who just have fatigue of that issue and are just not probably going to want to discuss it as much as we have been.
Guys, one last question, and then we'll take, if there's any other questions from the audience, we'll start with those. But both of you mentioned we've got a lot of new members that have been elected, both in the House and Senate. We've got a lot of clients on the line. What do you guys have any advice on outreach to new members? In terms of effective communication, in terms of getting our clients' messages out to you, and just any kind of thoughts you have on that. And Russell, I'll give you the first bite of the apple on that if you don't mind.
Yeah, I would just urge patience with them. I think back to my first year in the General Assembly, complete blur, akin it to trying to drink through a fire hydrant. It was funny. I saw an email the other day from a new member who, it's a little comical, I guess, but I shouldn't find it that way. But this person said, that they offered themselves to serve on the ethics committee. That they would serve on the ethics committee for us all, and I just found that a little funny because it just shows that it's a huge learning curve for new members to try to you're trying to figure out who everyone is. You got 124 members in the South Carolina House. You've got 1 million different people coming at you with different pieces of legislation. So it really is a blur to try to make things slow down and understand exactly the process. So I would, for the members, for your members, Brian, I would just urge patience with the new members, but clearly it's vitally important to build those relationships. And for us that work in that environment each and every day, I think we would all attest that it really is about building trust. And the only way you build trust is to build a relationship with each other, to know that when someone brings you, an issue, that you can bank on what they say. And to Brian, to your credit, to Amber's credit, to the entire McGuireWoods firm, y'all do a fantastic job of that. And so it's always a pleasure working with all of you on the issues that matter to the folks that you represent. But just urge a little bit of patience, because it's certainly, I'm still learning each and every day, and I'm heading into year number 8, and there's always something each and every year that I learn new. That budget process is a beast to try to understand that. And it's something that, we seem to go faster and faster each year with the budget. I'm not necessarily sure that's a good thing when you're talking about the billions of dollars that we're appropriating to the different agencies. We seem to do it pretty quickly each and every year, more and more quickly, it seems. So it would probably do us well to slow down on that and try to have a little bit more dialogue and debate on those issues. But nevertheless, we'll take it as it comes. But again, just a credit to what y'all do, making our jobs a lot easier.
This world always needs more lobbyists, is what I say, Russell. Hey, Brandon, do you have any thoughts or advice on folks that in terms of effective outreach to legislative members, preferred communication, et cetera, that any thoughts you have on that? We'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So we spoke about this earlier, but I think we're going to have right around 24 or 25 new members. I do think it's above 20, but I think it's close to 25. And if you get to 25, that means 1/5 of the House is going to be new members, which is a pretty staggering number. What we've been averaging about 18 to 20 in the last couple of elections anyway. But this is definitely something that, takes time. I think back, just like Russell, to my first year in session, it's baptism by fire is by far the best way to look at it. I do think that there are some good ways to do it. COVID does restrict a lot of what you could do. My favorite way, and I think the best way for me getting to know lobbyists or groups who were interested in bills, was one-on-one meetings, especially in the office, just so I could get to ask any question I wanted to ask. A lot of new members, they either fall into two camps. I think they either fall into the camp that they think they know everything and they're going to quickly learn they don't, or the members who feel like they know nothing and they don't know who to ask or how to ask. And I think that a lot of just building a personal relationship with members is key. A lot of these members are going to be on committees, and a lot of them are going to be on committees that they are not experts in that subject field probably. So really trying to educate them on a one-on-one basis. I think obviously meeting in person is probably going to be very restrictive. But doing stuff like having one-on-one phone calls before session, I think a lot of these newer members, have some time right now before the Christmas holidays really kick off to do that. I think that's really important. If you think you can corral some of them just to get to know them, that'll mean a lot. I think back to my first year, meeting the McGuireWoods group was very important to me, and getting to know the whole team. It certainly made the transition very easy for me, and it built up a lot of trust that I knew I could go and ask y'all something, and I was going to get a real thoughtful and straight answer to my question, whether it was the answer I wanted to hear or not. It was always going to be truthful and to the point. So I think building that close relationship with members, especially the new ones who don't know any better, and they don't know what they don't know. And like Russell said, some of them are going to want to conquer the world, or think they're going to conquer the world in their first year. So I think, getting to know them, so when that moment hits that they, realize that they're not conquering the world, or they're not, the supreme leader of the house in their first year, I think it'll be good to have those personal relationships built with them.
Well, great. Thank you both for giving us a good legislative preview. I want to be careful with everybody's time. Look, I know I speak for the entire McGuireWoods team. I think we could talk politics and legislative affairs for many hours to come, but this is just obviously a quick preview. I do want to remind all of our folks that are on the line, we will have this call recorded, or this call has been recorded, and so we can make that available to anyone that would like it. And then also, if anyone on the phone call has any questions for any of our speakers, don't hesitate to reach out to Amber or myself, and we'll make sure we get those questions to these folks. And then again, to the speakers, thank you so much for your time. The insight and wisdom was truly interesting, and we just appreciate your time so much, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks,
Thank
Brian.
you.
Thanks, Brian.
All right, thank you all. We'll conclude the call.